Hello, everybody. This is Radhika Iyengar from the Center for Sustainable Development. And here's
Hey,
Ancient. We work on the Eco Ambassador program, and there are two objectives we want to accomplish with the Eco Ambassador program. One is using science to inform day-to-day decisions. And the second part is eco activism. How can we engage in eco friendly measures and ways to improve our own lifestyles as well as influence people so that we can have a lot of people focusing on earth and sustainability. So having said that, we have the perfect person to tell us about sustainability and eco-consciousness in the fashion industry today. We have Dana Cohen, and I'll let her introduce herself, and then Hen will ask questions. Dana, over to you.
yeah, so my name is Dana Cohen, and I've been a designer in the fashion industry for the last 12 or so years. I've worked for, large and small companies from, Banana Republic and JCREW, companies that you see on the streets every day, to smaller, more eco-minded companies like Rogan and Loom State. I'm currently working on some eco initiatives, some entrepreneurial startups for myself, having seen all the crazy things that happen in the fashion industry and just wanting to make a change. So that's me.
Thanks for joining us. So Dana, we wanted to kind of start, you mentioned the different clothing brands, which we're very familiar with, but I think the actual details of the fabric can be new to a lot of people. So we wanted to just start by asking you kind of fabric 101, from the work that you have done, if you could just share with us the most common fabrics that are used, but also the environmental consequences of those different fabric types.
Throughout the course of my career, I've probably used every fabric on the face of the earth, from man-made fibers like polyester or nylon or even TENCEL, to the more natural fibers like cotton or linen or even leather. Analyzing the environmental consequences of these fabrics is extremely complicated because, a lot of people just think about the fiber and where it comes from, but you have to think about like the entire life cycle of the garment when you're thinking about the environmental consequences of a fabric. So it's not just, the fiber itself, whether it's natural or man-made, whether it comes from renewable or non-renewable resources. You have to think about, the land that, for example, cotton is grown on, the water used in irrigation, the water used to process materials or to dye them. And then what happens when the materials get in the consumer's hands? What happens when they wash the materials? You have to think about, for example, in the case of synthetics, like what, polyester is shedding microfibers into our waterways. So you have to think about that. And finally, you have to think about what happens when someone is done with a garment. Like if it ends up in a landfill, how quickly does it degrade? So it's extremely complicated. The most common fiber right now in apparel is polyester. I think it's something like 60% of all apparel is made of polyester. And part of that is because it's an inexpensive fiber. And part of that is due to the rise of active. As an apparel category, it's the largest and the fastest growing apparel category. And synthetics have great quick drying and performance capabilities. But polyester is made from non-renewable resources. It's an extremely energy intensive process to create it. Like I was saying before, it can release microplastics into our waterways. It's extremely, we don't even know what the results of that is yet. And then at the end of its life, it ends up in a landfill and it can be there for decades, if not centuries. So that's just polyester.
Right.
Every fiber has a story like that, and it's extremely complicated to analyze. And it leaves me, as someone who studies this and thinks about this all the time, very overwhelmed. So I can only imagine how the consumer feels in these situations. But it's not simple, and it's clothing companies aren't making it simple, because it's really difficult to educate the consumer.
Right, and that makes sense. Given all the different nuances, though, do you think currently, from what you know now, are there still certain fabrics that should be preferred when the consumers are making daily decisions about, which types of clothing to pick? Are there some that you would recommend?
Definitely. I mean, I think the best piece of advice I ever received as I started thinking more about sustainability and what choices to make was, don't try to be perfect, just try to be better. So for example, in the case of polyester, recycled polyester is really common right now. It's a huge trend in the fashion industry. People are taking plastic bottles and turning it into fabric. And that's amazing because basically you're taking trash and you're upcycling it and creating something of greater value. And while that recycled polyester still has its issues, it still has the microplastics releasing into the water and the issues at end of life, it's better, right? So if you have the choice between polyester and recycled polyester, choose recycled. But then there are fibers that are just great fibers that don't have those qualifications. So I love hemp. Hemp is an extremely durable fiber. It requires like very little water, if any, to irrigate, no pesticides. It's extremely strong, so it will last a long time in your wardrobe. And actually, that brings up a great point. I think one of the things you should just think about when you're consuming is just to buy things that will last a long time in your wardrobe, because the best thing that you can do is to keep it something in circulation for a long time. So the worst thing you can do is buy something wear it once and throw it out, which unfortunately is the fate of a lot of purchases these days. Other great fibers, TENCEL is an amazing fiber. So this is on the man-made fiber spectrum, but it is created by a manufacturer called LENZING, and it is made with trees, which sounds like a natural fiber, but it goes through such an intense processing that it's considered synthetic. And TENCEL is amazing because the process in which they create it is completely closed loop. So they're reusing a lot of the processing agents that would normally be kind of harmful waste in the process. They keep it in the process, which minimizes the amount of harmful waste. So it's a really cool process and a great fiber. Those are just two of my favorites, but I think the most important thing is to just ask, to demand more of the brands, ask the questions, reach out on Instagram where you have a direct line of contact to these brands and say like, where is this cashmere from? Where is my polyester from? Is it recycled? Or ask questions about end of life. What can I do with this when I'm done with it? To me, that's the one question companies aren't really asking themselves as they're creating more sustainable options out there. They're thinking about the fiber, but not necessarily what happens when you're done with it.
That's a great point. And I think kind of also putting it on the consumers a little bit to become more active consumers in having that inquiry and asking questions.
I think without that demand, the companies aren't necessarily forced to take the initiative. It's really about pleasing the customer at the end of the day, right?
Right.
These are businesses, unfortunately, and they want to make money. And so if the customer is demanding that, they're going to know that it's important to the customer and they better react.
Right. And actually, when you were explaining some of the fabrics, you already touched on some of the latest trends, but are there some other kind of general fashion industry trends that are happening or kind of reverse practices to make things more sustainable?
Yeah, I think there's a couple really big trends in the industry with regards to sustainability. So one is the rental market, the rental economy. People, there are companies like Rent the Runway offer people the ability to, wear something once or twice and then kind of get something new in its place. So this helps solve what we call the take, make, waste economy that we've sort of gotten used to. There's also a resurgence in resale. So companies like the REALREAL or THREDUP are offering customers the ability to make sure their clothes stay in circulation for as long as possible. And I think the last trend, and probably the biggest one when it comes to my involvement in sustainability as a designer, is circularity. So thinking about how can we use the materials that are already out there as opposed to creating new materials. So whether that's through recycling or using waste as a resource, and then keep those materials in circulation. So thinking about what happens to them at the end of life as well. So I've been working on two different projects with that respect. One is a leather line that's coming out soon called Higher Goods. It'll be available this holiday season, and that is created strictly from leather scraps. So leather is has an interesting environmental footprint. It's not the most amazing material because the animals, like they don't have a great impact on the land, but leather as a material is extremely durable, and it's also biodegradable. So I think it's a great material because it can stay, it retains its value over time. So it can stay in circulation for a really long time. So by not creating any actual leather for the product and just by using waste, we're starting the circular design process, offering really high quality goods and then keeping them in circulation for a long time. And if the garment or the accessory does come to the end of its life, it will degrade in a landfill. And so that's really important to me, is making sure that at the end of its life, there is a plan. One of the other really exciting projects I've been working on is a line of degradable activewear. So as I was saying earlier, synthetics have a huge impact on the environment, both through using non-renewable resources, through microplastic pollution, and then sitting in a landfill at the end of their life. So I've been working on something that also uses waste as a resource, so using only recycled fibers, making sure that those fibers will degrade in marine water so they won't contribute to microplastic pollution, and then making sure at the end of their life that they're not going to sit in a landfill for hundreds or thousands of years. So I think, you know, as a design community, people are starting to think about these things. It's really hard to implement when you're in a big company, and so I left to make sure that I could kind of prioritize these things. And then again, it comes back to the consumer. If they demand it, maybe these companies will prioritize it more.
Yeah, and that's great. And you touched upon this now, but when we say degradable, it's almost a similar concept as when we talk about like food being compostable.
Compostable and degradable are actually two different things. So when we talk about degradability, which is like biodegradability, but biodegradability has a certain amount of time it needs to happen in. I believe it's like 180 days in order to qualify to be biodegradable. But biodegradability and degradability happen in an environment without oxygen. So when something gets sent to a landfill, there's no oxygen, and then that's the natural process of the product kind of degrading over time.
Right.
And really important things to consider during the process of degrading and even composting, which I'll get to next, are when you can imagine, like when the garment is degrading, little pieces of it are basically going into the earth, right? And they're being eaten by microbiome. And the process is complete, the biological process is complete when the microbiome kind of fully eat the product. So natural fibers will degrade in a very short amount of time, and synthetic fibers on the other end of the spectrum will take hundreds, if not thousands of years. But the synthetic fibers, and actually natural fibers too, can be treated with such chemically intensive processes during their creation that those chemicals can leach into the soil during the degradation process. So it's not only important to think about whether or not it will degrade and how long it will take, but it's important to think about what's going to happen during that degradation process. So for the consumer, they can look for things like OEKO-TEX certifications, and that ensures that no harmful chemicals were used, BLUESIGN certified, you know, things like that. And then on the other hand, composting is something that can happen in your backyard. So something that is degradable in an anaerobic environment, meaning without oxygen, isn't necessarily going to compost, and vice versa. And the complicated thing about composting is, especially when it comes to apparel, is that we're not set up yet to compost apparel. So if there's a company advertising a compostable t-shirt, for example, and you throw that in your compost bin, when it gets to the composter, they're going to take it out because it's not necessarily, they're not set up to compost it. So it would have to be something that you would do in your own backyard, which might take a little bit longer than an industrial compost facility.
Wow, this is so informational. A lot, yeah, different nuances.
It's very dense.
That's
this
great.
is fantastic. Thank you, Dana. So my question, I guess my last question to you, and I'm still trying to recover from all the great, suggestions that you have given, and my mind is like thinking right now double speed, but I'll try to concentrate. Thanks for all the information. Is that, do you think this is just an upcoming, so people like you who have influence in the fashion industry, do you think that it's just a handful of you who are trying to bring this sustainability field into practice, or do you think that the big companies internationally and domestically are just going to go business as usual for the next 20 years? What does your trend analysis basically say?
I think that the big companies are catching on. You do see corporations like Gap Inc., where I was most recently employed. They have a lot of people focusing on bringing in more sustainable fabrics. It just takes a lot longer when you have such massive quantities and you have commitments for the future to integrate those new fibers and systems and supply chains into their ecosystem, basically. I do think there have been a lot of commitments from a lot of large companies, and again, consumers should look up companies and see what those commitments have been, and see if they want to support them based on those commitments. But it will take a long time, and I think technology hasn't necessarily caught up with our desire for sustainability. So again, going back to polyester, because I love to talk about polyester, one of the things to think about with polyester, especially whether or not it's recycled, is that we don't yet necessarily have the capability to recycle it again once it's in a fiber form. So especially like if it's a blend or a garment mixed with spandex, we can't necessarily take that and recycle it, break it down into fiber, and make it into a new garment. So that's kind of the end of the life cycle for that garment. So the bigger companies that have the financial capability to be doing their research and investing in these technologies, that's where they need to be focusing their energy, and that's where the consumer needs to be pushing them. I think right now it's a little bit superficial in a lot of ways, and they need to be the ones to kind of create the change that needs to happen with technology in order to make us more truly sustainable.
So a lot of consumers asking whether, so all the questions that you mentioned, the life cycle of the product and what is it made of, rather than just going with the label, they should be focusing on the type of fibers it is made of, be cautious, and also ask a lot of questions using the technology that people have access to. So I think this is fantastic. You have given us a lot of things to think of, and also for our eco ambassadors to take on this message and see every time they're going to a market what type of products they are buying, and hopefully become more conscious consumers and focus on less wastage, as well as understanding the type of product that they are purchasing. Thank you so much, Dana. This has been very, very helpful, and hopefully we'll keep you. I think this 15 minutes is not really doing justice to your conversation, so we need to make you come over to Colombia, or maybe wherever we have our eco ambassador meeting, to have a workshop with you, and maybe ask questions then.
Love to. There is a lot of information. It can be overwhelming, but again, don't try to be perfect, just try to be better.
That's nice. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Dana.
Thank you for having me.